what could be more timely? We have seen in the news, of course, the very scary and sad stories about shootings that have gone on in our country. Well, Professor Greg Wallace from Campbell University Law School, right across the way, by the way, he's a neighbor here. He is an expert in this area. Let me tell you a little bit about his background. He teaches constitutional law with a concentration in free speech, church and state, and constitutional interpretation. He also teaches a course on firearms law and the Second Amendment. So in other words, he knows exactly what he's talking about here. He received his JD degree with high honors from the University of Arkansas Little Rock School of Law, where he graduated first in his class. He was editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and he won a national moot court competition. He also obtained an MA degree with honors from Dallas Theological Seminary. Before joining Campbell, he was a visiting professor at the University of Arkansas Little Rock School of Law. He also served as a law clerk to U.S. District Court Judge Susan Weber Wright. He's also argued many disability cases before federal courts. So today, he's going to be taking a look at the different proposals made by, among others, President Obama, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, and other gun control advocates, particularly in light of the recent shootings that we've seen in our country. With that, I give you Professor Greg Wallace. I'm going to let you put that on. Okay.
Thank you, Donna, and it's great to be with you today to hear some politicians talk. We are at the verge, our society is at the verge of extinction due to gun violence. Well, let me assure you that that's not the case. Right off the bat, I want to suggest to you that illegal violence with guns is actually decreasing in the United States. Gun homicides are down 49% since 1993, and that's during a period when gun ownership is rising. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a causal relationship between increasing gun ownership and decreasing gun homicide rate, but it certainly, I think, debunks the common lie that is told by many politicians that more guns mean more gun violence. Now, in beginning, I want to say just before we look at some of the specific proposals that people like President Obama and Hillary Clinton and others have suggested, I want to make just a few introductory points here. And of course, one is that the Second Amendment to the Constitution, according to the Heller case, protects an individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense. And when we talk about gun control, gun regulation, this is not an area of the law like driving a car where the government can virtually regulate without limit. Every law that supposedly makes it more difficult for bad guys to get guns also makes it more difficult for good guys to exercise their constitutional right to own and use firearms for self-defense. Therefore, because this is a matter of constitutional law and not just general unfettered government regulation, every gun control law needs to be subjected to a couple of types of scrutiny. First of all, we need to know whether the gun law is effective, whether the proposed gun law actually will reduce illegal violence by keeping guns out of the hands of terrorists, criminals, mentally ill, mass shooters. And second, we need to know whether the gun law is narrowly tailored. In other words, whether it doesn't sweep too broadly and unnecessarily burden the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. Ending illegal gun violence is critically important, but so is protecting basic civil liberties. And at the bottom, I was happy to hear Donna, reaffirm again the John Locke Society's commitment to freedom. At the bottom of this issue is the issue of freedom. If government can take away your guns, it can take away other liberties as well. I recently was in China to help our law school set up an exchange program there. And I had a very frank discussion with some young law professors who we talked about the availability of guns in China and the extent to which people can own, possess guns. And of course in China you can't. The only people who possess guns in China are the criminals. And if you get caught with a gun in China, it is a very, very severe penalty. So, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, let's see, no guns, no liberties in other areas. Is there a connection there? Well, maybe there is. Now, the other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that I think we can all agree on the result that we want. Nobody, including gun rights advocates, wants guns in the hands of terrorists, criminals, or persons who are mentally deranged. But the big question is how? How do we get to that point? Now, President Obama and Hillary Clinton and Michael Bloomberg, who runs the Everytown for Gun Safety and the Mayors Against Illegal Guns, the Brady Campaign, Moms Demand Action, which is another Bloomberg-sponsored group, and the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. If you listen to what they're saying, they say, well, we want common sense gun safety laws. It used to be we just want gun control. Then they decided that wasn't very good messaging, so they said common sense gun laws. And now they've changed it even more recently to add the term safety in there. So that's the messaging for the gun control side. We want common sense gun safety laws. Now that's a cute term, but many of the proposals that these folks, these organizations have put forward really will do little to reduce the major drivers of gun-related deaths: inner-city gang violence and domestic violence. In fact, the Washington Post fact checker on December 10th, 2015, analyzed 12 mass shootings since Newtown and concluded that no current or proposed gun laws would have prevented any of those shootings. In an AP story by Michael Sisak dated January the 5th, 2016, he says and demonstrates that Obama's measures would not have kept guns from the very mass shooters he was so passionate about in his speech. Now, the Washington Post and the AP, the last time I checked, weren't bona fide conservative organizations, okay? So these are supposedly mainstream news organizations who themselves have concluded that the proposals that are being made by this group here are not going to be effective in reducing the very kinds of violence that they are concerned about. It is not common sense to enact ineffective gun laws, especially when those gun laws affect the constitutional rights of millions of people. Now, I want to talk about some of the specific proposals that have been made, not just recently, but going back several months and years here. As most of you know, President Obama came out in early January and announced several executive actions in which he was going to take steps toward reducing gun violence. My overall take on those is that, frankly, it was much more political theater than substance. Most of what President Obama proposed was simply enforcement of existing laws. And unfortunately, the Republicans sort of added to the theater by going on television and claiming that President Obama was overstepping his executive authority and all that. the proposals were very modest and frankly, for the most part, uneventful. And yet it was obviously rich political theater at a time when our nation probably didn't need that. We needed some real serious proposals to deal with the problem of terrorism, mass shootings, and other gun violence. Now, the first thing that President Obama wanted to do is he says that anybody in the business of selling firearms must have a license and conduct background checks or be subject to criminal prosecution, including internet and gun shows. And he said it's not where you do it, but it's what you do. Well, several media outlets inaccurately reported that President Obama had extended background checks to gun shows and online sales. President Obama did not close the so-called gun show loophole. Now, how many of you ever heard that term before, gun show loophole? Well, that's really a misnomer, because what they mean by that is private sales of guns, sales from one private party to another private party. Somehow they talk about this in terms of gun shows because they think that that's where most of the private sales take place. That's not really necessarily true, but President Obama has advocated at other times, as well as Hillary Clinton and others, for these so-called universal background checks. Now, universal background checks are checks that are laws that require background checks for private sales to close the so-called gun show loophole. President Obama did not do that with his January executive actions. He simply all he ordered was that the current law, which requires those who are engaged in the business of selling firearms to have a federal firearms license and to conduct background checks. Those who are not in the business of selling firearms may not be issued a federal firearms license, and they cannot perform background checks. Now, what does engaged in the business mean according to the statute? Well, a dealer in firearms is a person who devotes time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms as a regular course of trade or business with the principal objective of livelihood and profit through the repetitive purchase and resale of firearms. But such a term shall not include a person who makes occasional sales, exchanges, or purchases for firearms for the enhancement of a personal collection or for a hobby, or who sells all or part of his personal collection of firearms. All President Obama did in this instance was to take a highlighter to the language of the Gun Control Act and tell the ATF to go out and actively search for such people who are engaged in the selling of firearms as a business and who don't have a federal firearms license and who are not doing background checks. Now, frankly, just telling the ATF to enforce existing law more aggressively shouldn't have been newsworthy. He should have done this from day one in his administration and not waited to year 8 to do it. Now, the potential problem here is that the ATF may too aggressively enforce the existing law and chill gun sales by marginal dealers, persons that are closer to the legal line than they had been and might realize now they need to stop selling guns. That's okay. If they are in the business of selling guns, they need to have a federal firearms license and they need to do background checks. But what President Obama did was not to close this so-called gun show loophole. Now, President Obama also suggested that violent criminals are buying guns on the internet with no questions asked. And he said, I forget whether it was in his speech or in the town hall meeting that followed it, he said a recent study found that 1 in 30 people looking to buy guns on the internet had a criminal record. Well, buying guns on the internet is much more difficult than President Obama suggests. A licensed firearm dealer, that is an FFL, can sell over the internet only if that FFL ships the firearm to another FFL where the buyer picks it up and undergoes a background check. Likewise, if you want to buy a firearm online from a seller in another state, whether a licensed firearm dealer or not, the seller cannot ship the gun to your doorstep. Rather, the seller must ship the gun to another FFL where the buyer picks it up and undergoes a background check. I was back in my home state of Arkansas several years ago, and my brother had a handgun that I wanted to buy, a SIG P229, nice handgun. And so I paid him for it. Now, I couldn't just take that gun after I paid him for it and get in my car and drive back to North Carolina where I live. No, that would be a felony under existing law, and us lawyers, we don't generally want to commit felonies, and because that's not going to work out too well for us. So what we had to do in order to comply with the law is we took it to the local FedEx, and I got a copy of the federal firearms license from Fuquay Guns, which is who I do business with, and he sent it by FedEx to Fuquay Guns. Well, under the law, Fuquay Guns takes that gun and temporarily puts it in their inventory, and then when I come to pick it up and they transfer it to me, I have to fill out the ATF form, and they run the background check on me at that time. So now, you can buy a handgun from a private, non-commercial seller who advertises the gun on the internet without a background check. But first, it's still a felony for private sellers to sell to prohibited persons. Even though they don't run a background check, if they have reason to know that the person is a prohibited person, it's still illegal for them to sell to a prohibited person. And second, most private sellers are law-abiding citizens and are not going to sell unless they meet the buyer face-to-face and the buyer produces proper identification and affirmation that the buyer is not a prohibited person. I've sold firearms privately as a person on a number of occasions, and I'm always very conscientious to make sure we have a bill of sale, and I also, as part of that bill of sale, require the person to affirm and sign that they are not, they do not fit into any of the prohibited categories when buying a gun. And by the way, you can't ship a handgun by mail, and the UPS and FedEx won't ship firearms between non-licensees. So even getting the gun to somebody, shipping it to somebody is going to be very difficult. Now, North Carolina is a little bit more restrictive in that North Carolina does regulate private sales, and through the gun permit, the pistol permit system, it regulates private sales of handguns. So if I want to sell you one of my handguns, you have to go down and either get a concealed carry license or get a pistol permit, and in both of those instances, background checks are run on you. But President Obama said that violent criminals are buying guns, all over the internet with no questions asked. That's not exactly the case. In fact, the study, this 1 in 30 statistic, came from a dubious study that was done on armslist.com by the Everytown group, which Michael Bloomberg's group. And what they did was that they surveyed 13,000 want-to-buy listings between February and May of 2013. That's only 5% of all the Arms List ads. Only 5% of those 13,000 disclosed contact info where they could go in and find out whether this person does have a criminal record or not. So that's now the number's down to 650. Using that contact info, 1/30 of those 650, or 22, had criminal records. And this was a want-to-buy list. There was no evidence that any of these 22 were actually able to purchase firearms illegally. So when President Obama says 1 in 30, people were buying guns on the internet who had a criminal record, that's not exactly true. Now, How effective are background checks? Well, as I said earlier, the vast majority of vendors at gun shows are federal firearms licensees and require background checks. Guns purchased online or even out of state cannot be sent directly to the buyer. They must be sent to a federal firearms licensee who then performs a background check. So, how will expanding background checks to cover purely private sales keep more guns from the bad guys? Well, I think this is an interesting question to ask, because what you're essentially trying to do is if you impose a system that requires background checks on purely private sales, there's going to be a part of that system that's going to have to be voluntary. People are going to, now as I said, in North Carolina, if I sell a handgun to you, you're going to have a concealed carry license or a pistol permit, which means you're going to have voluntarily gone down and gotten those and had the background check run on you. I'm going to have to take your word for it, voluntarily sell that to you. So there are a number of different proposals on how to do this. One proposal is to say, well, require that anybody that are selling guns privately, one private person to another, require them to go to a federal firearms licensee and pay a fee so that the background check will be run on them. Well, are terrorists, criminals, mentally ill, are they going to voluntarily show up at a FFL and submit to a background check so that they can complete the sale? I don't think so. I think it's highly unlikely that the people who are selling guns privately from one private person to another are going to voluntarily go in and have a background check. Now, the law-abiding people will, but not the terrorists, not the criminals, and not the mentally deranged. Merely expanding background checks, I think, ignores where most criminals get their guns. The vast majority of criminals get their guns illegally from family and friends. In fact, in the town hall meeting, the commentator from CNN said that this is what happens, and President Obama says that that's not true. Well, what President Obama said really wasn't true. Less than 1% of criminals are buying guns at gun shows. And President Obama avoided that statistic. That's based on studies by both the Justice Department and a professor up the road here at Duke named Philip Cook, which show that the primary source for criminals in getting guns are their family, their acquaintances, and fellow gang members, their social network. And generally, criminals don't buy from people that they don't know because of a possible undercover police sting. So expanding these background checks is not going to really address this social network through which criminals get their guns, and requiring criminals to voluntarily come in and undergo these background checks is simply unrealistic. Also, universal background checks cannot stop people who are dangerous but have no disqualifying records in the system. The Umpqua College shooter up in Oregon was apparently seriously mentally ill, but passed Oregon's strict universal background check law. Both Colorado, where the abortion clinic shooting took place, and California, where the terrorist and San Bernardino shootings took place, both of those states have universal background checks, but the shooters there still got their guns. So did the WDBJ killer, get those call letters right there, the Charleston church killer, the Santa Barbara killer, the Maryland Mall killer, the LA airport killer, the DC Naval Yard killer, the Aurora movie killer, the Tucson killer that shot Gabby Giffords, the Virginia Tech killer that shot so many students at that school, and both Fort Hood killers. All of them passed background checks. Now, unfortunately, many states fail to voluntarily report criminal history, mental health, drug abuse, domestic violence records to the federal government for inclusion in the NICS database, the national, the NIC, which is the National Instant Criminal Check System, National Instant Check System. We call it NICS for short. A survey of states conducted in December of 2010 found that only 12 states reported 80% or more of their felony convictions recorded in their criminal history databases. As of November 2013, 12 states still had submitted less than 100 mental health records each. Most states do not comprehensively enter domestic violence protective orders and offender information into the proper databases. According to a November 2011 report by the Bloomberg Group, Mayors Against Illegal Guns, 44 states have submitted fewer than 10 records to the controlled substance file of a centralized nationwide database, and 33 states have not submitted any records at all. This is an appalling failure on the states to keep this national instant check system database up to date. Now, the NRA made a comment which I thought was a very good analogy. They said if you cast a net and the fish swim through the holes, you don't need a bigger net, you need tighter holes. But politicians don't want to fix the NICS system that is really missing the names of millions of prohibited persons. Now, President Obama, in his executive actions, did say that we need to make the background check system more efficient and effective. We need to hire more people. We need to improve technology. Those are good suggestions, and they should be supported. In fact, the NRA has fought for 20 years to put records of those adjudicated mentally incompetent into the NICS system. Senator Cornyn has actually introduced a bill in Congress to that effect that would remove a lot of the barriers to states doing so with NRA support. And the National Shooting Sports Foundation has said, we support further resources being allocated to staffing and increasing operational hours for the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System to make the system more efficient and responsive. So I think I would agree with President Obama on that point, that we need a more effective NICS system. Now, another one of these common sense gun safety laws are banning assault weapons. Interestingly, in a New York Times poll in December of 4th through the 8th of 2015, you hear a lot of people talk about how the majority of Americans want assault weapons bans. Well, in this New York Times poll in December of 2015, it showed that 44% favor assault weapons bans, and those bans are opposed by 50% of the American people. The first time in quite a while that a majority of the American people have indicated that they simply aren't persuaded that these assault weapons bans do any good. What is an assault rifle? Well, these are just ordinary rifles. They are not military weapons. They are semi-automatic in that they fire one bullet with each trigger pull. They do not spray bullets. You don't pull the trigger down, hold it down, and they spray bullets over everybody. That's not what these assault weapons, the so-called assault rifles, do. And they shoot small to intermediate-sized bullets that are common to hunting rifles or small game. Now, what's interesting is that this whole move toward assault weapons bans originated back in the early 1990s, when one of the major gun control groups at the time decided to pivot from trying to ban handguns, which they'd attempted to do for many, many years, and they were not successful. And so they decided to pivot and try to at least make some incremental progress by banning assault weapons. And the head of this group, their head strategy person, actually wrote in a memo that the reason why we might be more successful in banning assault weapons is because they're scary looking, and we can take advantage of the public's ignorance about how they work. Interesting. That's exactly what done. Watch this video here from an interview with
We had one of
Bloomberg.
Every single weapon used by the shooter in Connecticut would have been okay under the old assault weapons law. They were all
Yeah,
exceptions.
okay, so the law is flawed. Fix it.
Isn't it pretty hard to define what is an assault weapon? Because it's so easy to write around for manufacturers to create weapons that...
Well, if it can fire a lot of bullets very quickly, that's a good place to start, okay?
And
then
hunters
you
would
can
say-
argue what a lot is. Okay, let's pick it. Let's say 3. If you haven't hit the deer with 3 shots, you're a pretty lousy shot. That deer deserves to get away. Let's get serious here.
But that would ban most pistols. That would ban most...
No, but pistols are different. You have to pull the trigger each time. An assault weapon, you basically hold it, goes... Blah, blah, blah.
No, those are fully automatic weapons. So fully automatic
If
weapons...
you have a big magazine, you'll solve your problem. You still have to pull a trigger, but if it's 30 bullets or 20 bullets or 10 bullets before you run out, I would suggest the deer is... God wants that deer to live.
All right. Sorry. Mayor Bloomberg apparently either is being purposefully deceptive here, or he doesn't understand how these so-called assault rifles work. Fortunately, the reporter on the case was able to correct him. Assault rifles, again, are semi-automatic, which means you fire one bullet for each pull of the trigger. They are not fully automatic, and most people think that they are. And that's why a lot of people want to ban these fully automatic weapons. They are not fully automatic. In fact, assault weapons are actually defined by their cosmetic features that don't necessarily make them any more lethal than other types of rifles. Various laws over both at the federal level and at the state level have said something is an assault weapon if it has a telescoping stock, or a barrel shroud, or a pistol grip, or a bayonet lug. Now, I'll tell you, we haven't seen too many mass bayonettings lately, so I'm not sure what they're afraid of there. These are all things that make the rifle look more scary, but really have nothing to do with the rifle's rate of fire, its ammo capacity, or firepower. Well, how effective are assault weapons banned? The federal government banned assault weapons from 1994 to 2004, but a Department of Justice 2004 study found that the federal ban did not lead to any decrease in gun crime or gun deaths. Rifles are used in only about 3% of criminal gun deaths. Gun crime in the United States is overwhelmingly handgun crime. California bans assault weapons, but the terrorists still got their guns and illegally attempted to modify them. Connecticut, where the tragic Newtown shooting took place, had a ban on assault weapons when the Newtown shooter went on his rampage. Laws in France and Belgium banned fully automatic rifles that were used in recent terror attacks, but the terrorists still got the weapons they wanted. Now, some people will say, well, gee, why do people want these scary-looking weapons? Well, they're generally more accurate than a handgun or shotgun. They're easier to use because of low recoil. They're safer because their rounds will less likely to penetrate walls than pistol rounds. And they're very adaptable to preserving security of home or homeland. Most people like to have them for personal defense weapons. And so if you ban assault weapons, even though the ban is not effective, then you're going to be, again, keeping people from exercising their constitutional right to keep and bear arms for purposes of self-defense. Yeah, we'll have questions in just a minute. Please hold your question, though. I'm going to stop in just a couple of minutes, and we'll have the questions there. So AR-15 is a very effective self-defense weapon, and so again, if you ban these, if you make it more difficult for bad guys to get guns, then you're also going to make it more difficult for good guys to get guns. Here's an interesting illustration of this by Joe Biden, who President Obama chose to lead the task force on gun violence.
Asking if a ban goes into effect on certain kinds of weapons and high-capacity magazines.
And what's her name?
Kate.
Kate, if you want to protect yourself, get a double-barrel shotgun, have the shells, a 12-gauge shotgun, and I promise you, as I told my wife, we live in an area that's wooded and somewhat secluded. I said, Jill, if there's ever a problem, just walk out on the balcony here or walk out put that double-barrel shotgun and fired 2 blasts.
Like that. You'll be completely fine. Oh my God.
Ow, Alan!
What's wrong, Autumn?
Pull the trigger. Jesus.
Ow, it hurts. I don't like it.
I promise you, who's ever coming in is not going to. You don't need an AR-15. It's harder to aim. It's harder to use. And in fact, you don't need 30 rounds to protect yourself. Buy a shotgun. Buy a shotgun.
Okay, okay. Well, another proposal has been to ban sales to those who are on the no-fly list. The no-fly list is a secret list using a secret process that is based on secret facts. Nobody on the no-fly list has been charged or convicted of any crime. These are made up. The no-fly list is made up by persons who are merely suspected of being a terrorist or having terror connections. These are people who apparently are too dangerous to fly, but not dangerous enough to arrest. The list is notoriously inaccurate. Ted Kennedy was on the list at one point. And there is no fair or expeditious process for removing the names of innocent persons. It's almost entirely free of due process and judicial review. In fact, the no-fly list is the subject of an ACLU lawsuit now, claiming that it violates persons' due process. Now, the reason why this is a bad idea, and by the way, I think the governor of Maryland said that they were going to try this out. There's a bill pending in Hawaii now to do this. The big problem here is that it's simply unconstitutional. You can't buy a gun because we're afraid you might be dangerous. That's the standard. That's the test here. We don't keep people from exercising their constitutional rights based on unconfirmed suspicions of unnamed government officials. So, and by the way, if those who proposed this had listened to FBI Director Comey, he recently testified that currently the FBI is alerted when someone on the no-fly list tries to buy a gun. The FBI then can deny the purchase if there is a disqualifying factor under the law, or it can alert agents to investigate, all right? Well, President Obama says, I'm not coming for your guns. I think, frankly, millions of people don't trust President Obama or other politicians when they say they don't want to confiscate guns. One reason is that they keep holding out Australia's gun confiscation model as something that that we should follow as a nation here. They keep making proposals that don't work, and so it raises the question: what's your real agenda? If the safety of Americans is the real concern of these politicians, then I think they would have different priorities. There are gun bans that actually have been enacted at the federal level and enacted in some states. And there have been recently people who have been calling for gun bans. Dianne Feinstein, Senator, suggested a gun buyback program. The New York Times editorial in December, after the San Bernardino shooting, came out and said it's time for us to take everybody's guns. And an article in the New Republic said something similar. They keep saying, President Obama keeps saying, well, we just want to make incremental progress. And my question is, incremental progress toward what? Toward where? Where are we going with that? And then they keep saying, well, we want to have a meaningful dialogue based on truth and facts. This was something President Obama said at the town hall meeting, but they continue to misrepresent the positions of opponents. For example, President Obama said the NRA is opposed to background checks. Actually, the NRA was the one that came up with the idea after the Gun Control Act provision of having a waiting period on handgun purchases sunsetted. The NRA proposed a system of background checks instead of these waiting periods. So what should we do to reduce mass shootings? Very quickly, I think we need more aggressive enforcement of existing gun and murder laws. Especially in high crime areas and with straw purchasers. We need to prosecute every prohibited person who shows up and tries to buy a gun. This chart here shows that convictions under federal gun laws have actually dropped almost 35% over the last 10 years, 8 of those which were during the Obama administrations. In 2000, as I said earlier, about 80,000 people committed a felony by trying to buy a gun and giving false information on the ATF form, and only 44 were prosecuted for it. The firearm homicide clearance rates are very embarrassing low in minority neighborhoods. A second proposal here, we need to fix our broken mental health system. President Obama proposed spending $500 billion on improving mental health, but $500 million is 1/2 of 1% of what the federal government already spends on mental health. We have to ensure that states quickly report judgments of mental incompetence and other qualifiers to the NICS system. I would commend to you Senator Cornyn's bill that's currently pending in the Senate here. I think we need to put armed security at every school. That can be done, I think, particularly if you look to retired military personnel or retired police officers that could do that and not be cost prohibitive. And then I think we also need to stop disarming law-abiding citizens in most public places. Once the shooting begins, the only way to stop the killing is for somebody else present to have a gun. 1/3 of mass shootings are over in less than 2 minutes, and 2/3 of them end before the police arrive. And I can cite to you almost a dozen cases where mass killings were stopped by civilians with guns. And I think that sometime, and let me just say this, the idea of prohibiting, of making these gun-free zones only aids the criminal. Do you think criminals are going to say, somebody walks into like my law school over there, we have a little sign that says no guns on campus. Do you think if some disgruntled student wants to walk in and shoot up a bunch of professors, that he's going to be deterred by that sign? I don't think so. In fact, this picture right here says it all. That was the front of the building in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and you see the no gun sign here and bullet holes all around it. I don't think that's going to be effective. All right, let me take questions. And sir, we'll go to you first.
The one thing I always find is I'll say our side, the people who are for the Second Amendment, always seem on the defensive. We let the template be set by the Bloomberg and such, but the idea is the evidence is there. When you look at the statistics, most of the crime is committed by people with illegal guns. And we never let that be the opening salvo on our part. We let them say things, and we're always backpedaling. The other thing is, why do we accept the word assault? We've given them it. You said that they're semi-automatic. That's how we should talk. Whenever they say assault, you've got to correct it, because
that's why I put it in scare quotes. Yes.
On programs, you always see us submitting to their terms.
No, we do, and I think part of it is that we need better informed spokesmen for our side. We also need to have, though, the problem is I think you've got a media who is very much in the tank, and it's very difficult to get around the media roadblocks to be able to do that.
Could you touch on Fifth
The what?
Could you touch on Fast and Furious?
The Fast and Furious. Most of you know that was the situation where they ran arms or allowed arms to be sold over the border to drug cartels in the hopes of tracing down. Unfortunately, their system was broken and they didn't have a good way to trace it. Well, all I know is that somebody said, I guess the best way to get the federal government to buy me an assault rifle is to go join up with the drug cartel there, and I could get an assault rifle from the federal government then.
One thing we haven't talked much about is that we have a media here that creates a strange culture about guns by glorifying them in film and on video games and stuff like that. And we have First Amendment concerns, and so we have difficulty addressing the culture that's created by that, where those of us that are shooters have spent our time teaching our kids responsibility with guns and teaching them at ranges how to follow the proper rules and to handle them properly and so forth. How do we combat that culture? How do we combat that movement that's going on in the press that people see and the entertainment that they have to correct that some?
Well, I think we again, I think we need to have very good spokesmen. I think the NRA generally does a good job, but even then, they're easy to caricature by the other side. I think we need to have good spokesmen who are saying things like that. I think we need to make sure that we don't come across as nutty fruitcakes who are Second Amendment absolutists. I know there are some people within the gun community who think that, there should be no law restricting gun use, which none of the rights protected in the Constitution are absolute. I can't go out and exercise my right to religious freedom by sacrificing my child in my backyard to the God of my choice. So no rights are absolute. We need to quit doing some of the things and we need, I think, to engage in some serious conversation. But keep calling them on this. We need to keep calling them and say, look, the proposals that you're making don't work. And emphasize, look, we want as bad as you do to keep guns out of the hands of terrorists, mass shooters, murderers, criminals, the mentally deranged. But what you're proposing doesn't work. And we need to have more of a voice for the proposals on our sides, in that regard. Another question here? Yes, sir.
Virginia ended its law on Friday, not allowing us to conceal carry permits to go into Virginia. What about other states? We have a concealed carry permit here. Should we not be allowed to go to other states as well?
Well, interestingly, the Virginia situation, I think, is a model for how the gun rights and the gun control people got together and came up with some political compromise that was acceptable to both sides. Those of you that don't know about this, the Virginia governor and attorney general decided a month or so ago that Virginia was no longer going to grant reciprocity to people who have concealed carry license from other states, which would be tantamount to saying, we're not going to honor your driver's license if you have a driver's license from another state, that kind of thing. Well, what they did was they got together up there and both sides came together and they worked on a bill that provided some greater protections for domestic violence victims who are often disproportionate victims of gun violence. And then they, in order to get the gun rights group's support of this bill, they added the reciprocity back into it, and both sides came away relatively happy with the bill. And I think that's a good way to do it. But I think you're going to see the strategy of revoking reciprocity. That's probably going to be something that becomes more common, as we go along. Yes.
Could you expand on the well-regulated militia aspect, which is always...
Oh, do you have 30 minutes or an hour?
Just 10 minutes.
Justice Scalia, for the majority, writing for the majority, said that essentially the prefatory clause there in the Second Amendment explains why the Second Amendment was codified in the Constitution. It doesn't explain why we have an individual right or why we have a right to keep and bear arms. The main part of the amendment is that second part, which talks about the right to keep and bear arms, and the court concluded that that was an individual right that had a long pedigree in natural law and in the laws of England in terms of allowing people to keep and bear arms for purposes of self-defense. And the reason the prefatory clause covered why it was codified in the Constitution, not just, it doesn't define the right, it merely explains why it got put into the Constitution. All right? Yes?
Texas recently went to open carry, is that correct?
Yes, they did.
With no fanfare, it just kind of went in, right? So have you heard any concerns about it in Texas?
Did you know there's a constitutional right to open carry here in North Carolina based on a very old early 1900s case? And I have mixed thoughts about the open carry movement. I don't think it's a good thing to carry weapons just as a in-your-face exercise. I think that does more harm to the cause than good. Frankly, when I carry concealed because I don't want to know, I want the bad guy to know that I've got a gun, because guess what? I'm going to be the first one shot if he knows that. So I think it's I can understand why people want to open carry. I understand that, but I think too many of the open carry instances have been a sort of in your face. They're asking for police to show up. They want to video it. They want to do all this kind of thing. And I think ultimately it's hurting the cause. That's just my own view of it.
Several of the proposals that you advocate involve what seems to me to be pretty heavy government involvement, reporting by the states to of mental health cases, a national database, and
we already have those things.
Right.
Yes.
But stronger enforcement of it. In my mind, maybe that seems like conceding too much. Do you and would be ineffective to do basically because almost everything the government runs is so do you worry about that, or what do you think about that?
All right. I think that there is an effectiveness to background checks. Okay. I don't think necessarily expanding it to universal background checks, which would require voluntary action on the part of private parties to come in and undergo a background is going to make any difference. But I think the system in place, does deter to some degree, bad people. As I said, that one year there were 80,000 people that had been turned down because the information they gave was false. They indicated that they were not disqualified when in fact they were under the several categories of people who can't own guns buy or own guns under federal law. So I think those people ought to be prosecuted. I don't know how else we can, I don't have any problem with beefing up the National Instant Check System in that regard. The Federal Firearm Owners Protection Act prohibits the federal government from creating a national database or national registry of guns, okay? So all the information that's sent into the FBI when that background check is run can be kept by the FBI only for a few months and then must be eliminated from the system. And all those forms that are filled out by people are all kept by the local gun shops. They are not sent to the federal government. So I really don't have any problem with that system. It's not going to be a perfect system, but I think it will make a dent in at least saying, there are some people who are qualified to buy guns, there are some people who are not.
Do you worry about abuse?
Well, I worry about I worry about people keep proposing these measures that are ineffective, and I think what's their end game? And I do think for some politicians and gun control activists, I think their end game is the confiscation. I think some of them just don't like guns and they don't want people having guns. So I think the end game is confiscation. And so I think that's where we need to be very careful about working with them, so we don't get hoodwinked into, going along with that. But I don't think that the NICS system, as it's operating now, I mean, it needs to be beefed up. It needs to, existing laws need to be enforced. I don't think that system is necessarily going to lead to that. But I do wonder, once you start, as the NRA's little illustration there, once you start casting the net wider rather than tightening the holes in your net, I do worry about that. Yes. Okay, sure.
Well, going back to the list, what about, I guess, how are we defining mental incompetence? And what about some of the proposals, I believe, maybe it should be enforced by now, where they're throwing people into these lists of mental incompetence as a disqualifier because they've surrendered their right to control their finances?
Yes. Yes, that's a good question. One of the proposals that President Obama made was he suggested, and the Social Security Disability Administration is working on now, to whether people who have been adjudicated disabled or who have what's called a representative payee under Social Security Disability law are put into the NICS system. Well, I think that's a huge mistake, and I think it would probably be unconstitutional. Social Security Administration does not adjudicate mental incompetence. The only reason you get a representative payee is when you are incapable of handling your finances. So you might have an 80-year-old aunt who doesn't want to handle her finances and says, let my son or let somebody else do it, and they are appointed representative payee. That would be a huge mistake, and I think likely unconstitutional in that regard.
My question was basically along the same line with mental competency. There's lots of slippery slope arguments there. How do you just define what that constitutes and what is the potential for that being expanded and diffused? And then you have the mental health professionals, some of whom will say, we think this is a bad idea because it may prevent people from coming in. We've already got family doctors asking us if we own guns.
Yes. Under federal law, it's only if you have been adjudged incompetent or you have been institutionalized that you are disqualified from buying a firearm. Okay? So there has to be an adjudication that comports with due process in order for you to be adjudged mentally incompetent. The real problem right now is states just aren't reporting it. Those things happen, but states really aren't reporting that to the NICS system. What we don't want is anybody that goes in to be treated for depression and has been prescribed Xanax or something for anxiety or depression or whatever, that simply because you're receiving mental health treatment that you are prohibited from buying a firearm. I saw one statistic long ago that like a third of the American people have had mental health treatment at one time or another during their lives. So that would be very, very broad. I like the incompetent or the institutionalization. We've just got to have better reporting standards on that. And it has to comport with due process.
Professor Greg Wallace with Campbell, thank you.
Thank you.